That is the creative act. That is what happens in the Genesis account when God reaches down and brings up life out of the earth. It's chaos. It's the sea, right? It's going back down into the waters and then bringing order up out of that. But that's what we're intended to do. We need to remind ourselves that this is life. Well, hello and welcome to The Golden Thread. We've been thinking a lot lately about the sea, about ships and sea monsters. And so I wanted to start today by asking, what has your experience personally been with the ocean, with the sea? You know, for some, it's trips to the beach. For some, it might be sailing or surfing or swimming or fishing. For some, you might say that you've had less experience with getting to go to the ocean, but there's something about the sea, isn't there? There's something about the ocean that's kind of interesting to think about a little bit as to what is that? You know, there's something that draws us, I think. Why is it that, so many people will go and take a trip, sometimes even long distances, to just get to the edge of this large body of water and then just sit on the edge of this body of water and look at it just all day? What is it about the sea, that attracts us in that way, or that calls to us that we might just want to go and put our feet in it, or maybe swim in it a little bit, or do other things? But what is it about the sea that calls to us? And there's something, there's something kind of playful, I think, about the sea. There's this sense of fun and enjoyment and relaxation, and maybe even a sense of adventure that comes along with the sea. But there's also an aspect to the sea, I think, of a little bit of danger, right? Like there's a little bit of a sense in which the sea is big and powerful, and a lot of times I think as human beings, we're almost, there's something in us that is drawn to things that are bigger than ourselves, like mountains and also and forests and plains and fields and the ocean as well. And so I think that we kind of long for that there's a desire that we have to go out and to experience something that is bigger than ourselves. And when the ocean is wild, and when the waves are going and the wind is blowing, and maybe there's a storm of some kind, you can really see the ocean at its most powerful. And it reminds us of how small we are by comparison. I remember having an experience like this myself when my wife and I, we went and we took a trip to the coast of Maine, which I highly recommend if anybody gets a chance to go to the coast of Maine. Those beautiful red cliffs, and it's just such a great place to get to visit. And when we were there, one of the things that we wanted to do was to join a whale watching expedition. We wanted to get to go out and see some whales, and so we did. We joined a little whale watching expedition, which for if you haven't gotten a chance to do that, they put you on a boat and they just sail you out and go out to see some whales. And we went out and we sailed up into an area that was not that far off the coast of Canada, and it was very cold. And we did get to see some whales. There were like 4 humpback whales that we came across as we were out there, which was really cool. We saw also various other things. We got to see puffins, and at one point we came across a giant ocean sunfish, which is a strange looking creature. You'll have to look up pictures of that, but people thought it was a shark because it looked kind of like a dorsal fin in the water, but it's actually that's the way it swims, kind of vertically like that. It's a very strange creature. But anyway, we got to see all kinds of cool things while we were out there. And, but one of the things that was, just something of a concern with it was that my wife has a tendency to get a little bit of motion sickness. And so we knew that might be an issue, that there might be a little bit of seasickness. Now, we'd been sailing before, and she did fine with that. that, but, not out on the ocean. And so this was the first time kind of going out there. And it was actually a pretty long trip that we took out there. It was like 5 hours altogether to get out there, see the whales, and come back again. And so we were out there for a long time, and it was pretty cold and wet, and there's a little bit of up and down. And so about halfway through this trip, my wife starts to feel it a little bit. She starts to get a little queasy. So, I say, okay, just, sit down and just kind of try to stay centered, try to stay in the middle, and don't look around too much, that kind of thing. So she did okay for the most part with, some discomfort, but she kind of weathered the waves that way. Me, on the other hand, I've never really had too much trouble with motion sickness. That was never really something that particularly bothered me. And so I'm running all over the place. I'm taking pictures. I'm just kind of scampering all over this boat. And finally we get out there and we do get to see the whales, and so I'm taking pictures of whales and all this, and it was then that I'm doing this, I'm running around, that all of a sudden it hits me, right? And it's like a gut punch, gut punch of seasickness just suddenly hits me. And for anybody who's maybe experienced that, that once that button gets pushed, you don't unpush it. It's like when you don't get unsick while you're still out at sea. And so I just suddenly was just like, oh boy, I need to sit down. And it was kind of unfortunate because this was like right at the moment when the whales are there. And so there's whales breaching, off the side of the ship, and people are all excited and taking pictures. And I'm just kind of looking over there and be like, okay, all right, whales, all right, great. And so I got to have that experience of seasickness. And I remember all the way back, so it was like the hour of sailing back again. I'm just kind of sitting there with my eyes closed, and I found almost I could get into this kind of almost meditative state, and as long as I just kind of stayed in that place, I was okay. But the moment that I just opened my eyes and started looking around, I'd be like, oh, it hit me again, and I'd have to close my eyes and go back to that place. But I was thinking about this when we were thinking about this topic of the sea and of ships and how it relates to the world and how it relates to our lives. And we all experience times, I think, of our lives that are like that. You're just going along, you're minding your own business, life is good, and then all of a sudden you get that gut punch, right? That life just hits you with something unpredictable. That there's something about the sea that is like that. The sea is an unpredictable thing by its very nature. It's constantly in motion. It's constantly moving. There's uncertainty just baked into the nature of the sea. That's part of what makes it so powerful and also so dangerous too, that there's a great deal of unpredictability and uncontrollability about the sea. And life is that way too. There's just things that come and things that happen and hit us at various times. And there seems to be times in life where life becomes like that to a greater degree, right? The waves are getting big, and the boat is going up and down, and there's rough water, and so we can experience some of those times in our lives. And then there's times, of course, that are more smooth sailing, but we're always either heading out of or into a storm, you could say, right? And it's also that when we think of it in the larger perspective as well, when it comes to culture, I think that when it comes to our culture and our civilization and society, that there are times when chaos begins to become more rampant, when things are less stable and things become more uncertain. And even when you think about the sea and the image and the symbolism of the sea, even when it comes to the ancient tales, which we often think about here, that when you think about the myths and the ancient tales, the sea is most often related to chaos. It's this sort of primordial state of chaos out of which things emerge. And so we see it that way in the myths, and we see it, I think, oftentimes even that way in our lives, that our lives, sometimes we experience that kind of thing, the unpredictability of the world and the rising sort of chaos that can come about. And the question is, what do we do when that happens, right? What do we do when that happens in our lives personally? What do we do when that happens in our culture and in our civilization, when we look around and we see chaos? And what I want to talk about a little bit here today is that, just like what we've been thinking about with some of the other topics that we've talked about, that when it comes to these sorts of experiences in our lives, that there is an opportunity there, that there's an opportunity there rather than to be capsized and to be overwhelmed by the waves and for it to just be a destructive experience, that there are times that there's a way of being, there's a posture that can be assumed in these kinds of experiences that allows for transformation. We've talked about this before when it comes to the call to adventure, that when we go out upon the sea, when we go out into the chaos, that which calls to us, right? That which is bigger than us, that which is more powerful than us, there's an opportunity there for transformation, for something about us to be changed. And I know, like for me, for example, with this experience, it was actually really interesting getting to see the whales out there and then having my first experience with seasickness, because I really think that I learned a little bit of a lesson in humility during this experience. It was actually kind of a spiritual, you could say, sort of experience that I had, where after having this happen, and actually even while it was happening and reflecting back on it, in the days after, I really was thinking about how, I sometimes have a tendency to think of myself as almost as invincible, right? I can just run around and do all these kinds of things, and I don't need to worry about it. But the sea is so powerful. It's like an experience, an encounter with the sea, an encounter with something that is greater and more powerful than ourselves, can cause us to change the way that we see ourselves and change the way that we see the world. It allows for us to become transformed. And I actually think that experience was really powerful for me. And I think that I have grown a little bit in humility since having that experience and that encounter with something that was powerful in that way. And so when we're thinking about the sea, and we're thinking about these kinds of experiences that resemble that in our lives, the question is how do we adopt a posture that can help us to be transformed and not simply to be overwhelmed and destroyed by these kinds of experiences? And I think that what we can do is we can once again look to the ancient tales. We can look to the stories that can teach us a little bit of how we do that. And so what I want to do today is I want to actually spend a little bit of time talking about and thinking about some of the ancient biblical tales. We're going to look at some of the narratives from both the Old and the New Testament in the Bible, and just think a bit about what are some of these biblical narratives want to teach us about these kinds of experiences and the posture that we can assume in relationship to that which is represented by the sea, the chaotic, the unpredictable, the powerful, those kinds of things. And so we're going to look first of all at the book of Genesis. And so in the book of Genesis, this is the first book in the Bible and in the Pentateuch, and this is the creation story, the famous, of course, creation story, the creation of the world. And in this story, I think that what we will find is kind of the first thing that we can learn, and that is that that chaos, the sea, the chaotic state of things is not necessarily purely a negative thing. It's not purely a negative image. Rather, it provides an opportunity for transformation and for creation itself. When we think about the Genesis account, when it talks about God's creation of the world, it says that at first the world is without form and void. It's kind of empty and formless. And then it says an interesting thing. It says that the Spirit of God, the Spirit of creation, of the creative force in the world, it says that the Spirit of God hovers over the waters. And I think that's such an interesting thing because, again, this idea of the primordial sea, it's like the state of chaos out of which everything else emerges. And so it says that the Spirit of God hovers over the waters, and then God speaks and God begins to bring life. And the way that God brings life and form to the formlessness is that God calls up life, and he brings life, and he brings the world and land and dry ground and order up out of the sea of chaos. So we see that the chaotic the chaotic state of the world, this image of the sea, is not purely one that needs to be looked at as being just a negative thing or an adversary to be fought against. I think a lot of times we can look at the chaotic state of our own lives and almost want to just despair, or we look at the chaotic state of our lives or of the world and we just think of it as something to struggle against. It's just an adversary. It's just something that we have to overcome, that we have to deal with, that we have to face. And I think that there's a different way of looking at it, which is to look at the chaos and the disorder and the uncertainty that we may experience as being the state out of which life emerges. That, in a sense, it is the sea, it is the chaos that is the prerequisite for life itself. That the way in which God creates in the story is that he brings life up and out of this state of chaos. And so without that, if you don't have that, you actually don't have life. You don't have what you need for the possibility for life itself. And so we can see that that is the state of things. And if we continue with the story, in that first chapter of Genesis, we see God bringing the dry land up out of the sea, but then we also see this other aspect too, which is we begin to see vegetation coming up out of the land. And once again, it's the same kind of image, because if you think about let's see here, what the chaotic sort of element represents, or what sort of images that we can use that tie in with this, it's chaos is fragmentation, right? You could think of it as that chaos is what happens when order disintegrates all the way down, when things kind of get fragmented all the way down to their smallest constituent parts. And things are always in a state of doing this. Things are always in a state of kind of fragmenting down and getting back to that place. But think about this as another way of looking at it. Think about vegetation. Think about a garden. Think about things that grow and things that rise up and that form life and bear fruit and make life possible, make other forms of life possible, these kinds of things. What is the necessary prerequisite for those things? It's soil, isn't it? It's dirt. And so without dirt, you don't have a garden. And that is the case even in the book of Genesis as well, that the Garden of Eden, right, this kind of paradise that God creates, it rises up out of soil. It rises up out of dirt. And what is dirt? What is soil? Soil is when you take living things and you fragment them all the way down, right? You take trees and you take organisms and they die and they break apart and they fall to pieces and they go all the way down to this most disintegrated state to where you can't even recognize, there's no recognizable form of life that's even left in it. And that's what soil is. And that is the substrate. That is the prerequisite for all life to come up out of. So you have to have dirt. A lot of times we want to just have the garden, right? We want to see the fruit and all those kinds of things, but you don't get fruit without growth first, without planting seeds. And you don't get planting seeds. You're not able to plant seeds without having soil in the first place, which is that state of death. It is that state of disintegration all the way down. And this continues through the biblical narratives. We see even in the gospel accounts where Christ is teaching his disciples, and one of the things that he's most famous for using, and one of his favorite images to use, is the image of agriculture, right? So he has all of these parables, these kinds of stories that he uses to teach his disciples things about the way the world works. And one of the things that he says when he's talking to them about this is he says that it's necessary for things to die. He says it's necessary for, unless a kernel of wheat, unless a seed, unless a plant dies and scatters its seeds and the seeds fall to the ground, you're never going to get more plants. You're never going to get more life. You're never going to get the harvest. You'll never get there at all, because death is necessary. Chaos is necessary. It's necessary for things to fragment down in order for new life to come up out of that. And I think that is something that we experience even in our own lives as well, that wherever we experience chaos, there is the potential for new life. We see it once again a couple of times kind of playing out even in the life of Christ. We see the idea that when Christ is first born, we see Mary, and Mary is this woman who gets chosen by God to bear the Christ child. And when this happens, it says that the Spirit of God comes and overshadows her or rests upon her. That's that image again of the Spirit of God hovering over the waters, except this time the waters that are being hovered over are the waters of childbirth. They are it is a human being that is sort of hovered over, and the world gets created again anew in that way. And she gives birth to Christ, and then Christ goes on to do all of the things that he does. And we read about this in the Gospels, and in the life of Christ, we see once again the same kind of imagery that when Christ is beginning his ministry, he goes out and is baptized. And this image of being baptized is this image of him going down and the body going down under the waters and then coming back up and being raised back up again. And it says that when he does this, that the Spirit of God comes down and rests upon him. And it's that same idea again, the Spirit of God hovering over the waters, that in order to be able to rise up and go on to that next step, whatever that thing is, that next step of the journey, the hero's journey, right? These are all of these various steps, these moments of transformation, whether it's birth or whether it is coming of age or whether it is going out into the world to do the kinds of works that are intended for us to do. Each of those requires death. It requires a going down into the waters of chaos and coming back up again. And it says that the Spirit of God, that creative Spirit, is there recreating the world anew. And we act this out. We live it out. We live out these same stories in our own lives, but we have to be willing to go down before we can be raised back up again. And so, like, for example, I'm thinking here of some of the kinds of experiences that we may go through in our lives. I'm thinking of, like, let's say you have kids, right? So I'm thinking here of maybe there's a young mother, which is why I bring up, the image of Mary there with her experience. But we can think about it even in our own experiences. It's like you have this young mother and she has a baby, and the next thing you know, it's like you have a state of order. The world is in this kind of state of order and everything is great. And then all of a sudden here comes this baby, and now all of a sudden everything is chaos, and then maybe there's you've got a couple of kids, they come along and the chaos just continues, and it just becomes more and more chaotic, and there's like applesauce on the walls, and there's Legos on the floor, and you're stepping on the Legos, and things are breaking, and it's just noise and madness, and it's chaos, and it's just terrible, right? Like, that is the experience of having kids. Like, that's what that experience is. And you can imagine being a parent or being a mother or a father in this situation and looking at this and being like, why am I doing this? Like, what is going on? You can become completely overwhelmed by this kind of experience. And what I think is really important to remember in the midst of all this is that when we're looking at the chaos around us, that when you find yourself with your arms kind of plunged down into the chaos, when you find yourself going down into the chaos and bringing up order up out of that and raising up things and bringing up new life, right? Like planting seeds in the ground and having it grow and those kinds of things. When we have that experience, when we find ourselves in that kind of experience, what we can learn from these stories, or what we can remind ourselves and what we can encourage ourselves with, is this, that is the business of life. That means that you are doing life. Like, that is what it is. And sometimes we look at it and we think, oh, I must be doing something wrong because it's chaos. No, like, that is the creative act. That is what happens in the Genesis account when God reaches down and brings up life out of the earth. And we ourselves, in the same way, we live that out. And so whatever it is that we're doing, whether it's having a child or starting a business or beginning a creative project or whatever we do, it's messy, it's chaos, it's the sea, right? It's going back down into the waters and then bringing order up out of that. But that's what we're intended to do. And so we can encourage ourselves in that way, that when we experience that, we need to remind ourselves that this is life. This is life itself. This is the creative act that we get to participate in as we do that. So that's, I think, the first thing that we can learn when it comes to these accounts of the sea and what that represents for us in our lives. The other thing that I think we can learn about this is that life itself is the interplay between order and chaos, that life itself consists in are existing in that space in between, that sometimes we want to think that we want our lives to be purely order, right? We want everything, we think, oh, everything should just be order. But that's actually not the way that life works, that actually life is constantly in this state of struggle and in this state of flux and interplay between order and chaos, these things happening over and over again. And there's this constant cycle of life and death and rebirth that goes on. We see it once again in the Genesis account. If we skip forward a few chapters, we see the story of the flood, right? And the story of the flood comes about that after God has created the world and civilization has begun, things go off the rails. Things become chaotic again. And the chaos grows to the point where it becomes so great that it says that the earth becomes corrupt and filled with violence. And so it's just absolute bloodshed. And so what happens there is that God brings this flood, and the flood comes, and essentially what it does is it returns the world to that primordial state out of which it came. And this is something that happens periodically in our lives. This is something that I think that happens periodically in the course of civilization, that we get to a place where chaos begins to rise and the floodwaters rise, and what happens is that the world is being made anew. It's being remade, that there's a rebirth that's going on there, but there's also destruction. There's also danger and destruction, and oftentimes the ending of things and the crashing down of things that is necessary in the midst of all that. But that is a necessary element too, that chaos is not just the prerequisite for life, but it is actually a state that needs to be returned to from time to time. Because if that doesn't happen, what actually happens is we think, well, we just want everything to build up towards order. But here's the thing. Perfect order is not actually what is necessary for life. Nor is perfect chaos. Perfect chaos is death. Perfect chaos is anarchy. It's total disintegration. It's dust, right? Dust to dust. That's what it is. So it takes the world apart all the way down. But that is also the case when it comes to perfect order, because if the world goes to a state of perfect order, think about this. If you are cleaning, for example, you clean things up, you wipe down the table, you wash things, you sanitize things, you sterilize things. What are you doing there, really? You're removing the chaotic elements, and involved in that is removing life, right? You're getting rid of bacteria and germs and all of those kinds of things where life can grow that you don't want it to grow. And it's necessary that we do that. But what if you did that to the most extreme extent? Total sterility is death itself. If we could get the world to a place of perfect order, that would actually be death. It would be a mausoleum. It would be a tomb. That's what it would be. So that's not what we want. In fact, as things become more and more and more orderly, there is a need for the chaotic forces in the world to actually come up and pull things back down, because we don't actually want it to go all the way there, because if it gets all the way there, that's a dead universe. That's the end of all things. In fact, there was I believe a Mexican playwright called Carlos Fuentes, who said that perfect order is the forerunner of perfect horror. And I just love that quote. And I think what he's thinking there of is totalitarianism. He's thinking of things becoming more and more and more orderly to the point where it is just the end of life itself. And you can see as things become more and more and more ordered from the top down, there has to be more and more and more control and more restriction and all of those kinds of things. And what that leads to is totalitarianism. What that leads to is death. And so when that happens, we need to actually be looking for the other aspect. And so there's an aspect of life that is the interplay between these two things. And so when it comes to our own lives, we can be looking at like, hey, what do we need in our lives? Do we need more order, or do we need a little bit more chaos? Because we actually need both of those things. And And so we should, in some ways, we need to welcome when the chaos and the chaotic and the sea starts to rise. But what do we do? What do we do when that happens? Because it is dangerous, because the flood can drown and will overwhelm us if we're not careful. Well, the answer once again comes in that biblical story, which is that God speaks to Noah, and he says, now, Noah, what you need to do is to prepare, and you need to build a boat. You need to build an ark. And into this ark, you need to bring your family, and you need to bring two of every kind, all of these different aspects of creation around him, so that you can become a protector of creation. You need to build this vessel. You need to build this boat. And what is a boat? A boat is, in many ways, it is that which can contain and provide order in the midst of chaos. And so the next thing I think that we can learn from these stories is that when chaos begins to manifest itself, the answer is build a boat, build a ship, that which is able to sail and to navigate the storms and the seas of the unpredictability around us. And you'll notice that a ship is an interesting symbol, because you'll notice that it's not something that is planted in the ground. It's not something that's stationary. It's not something that lasts forever. It's not something that is too rigid, right? It has the ability to move. It has the ability to adapt to a changing world. And I think that for us, as we see things, the floodwaters begin to rise, we need to be able to kind of build these sorts of containers for our lives and for the life that surrounds us, in order to be able to navigate the changing landscape as the world begins to morph and begins to change and begins to transform. And so that's something that I think we can learn how to do. And we see this time and time again. We see this repeatedly in the biblical narratives as well, not just in the flood narrative. We see it in the life of Moses. In the life of Moses, in the book of Genesis, you see the Pharaoh who is representative of the totalitarian regime. That's what that is. And the totalitarian regime, of course, becomes fearful, as all such regimes do. It's fearful of being overwhelmed and overthrown. And so what do? They go out and they begin to kill the male offspring of the Hebrew people that are living in Egypt. And in fact, the way that they kill them, interestingly enough, is to throw them into the Nile River. Once again, the return to the state of chaos. And so they're going to be thrown into the river and drowned. So what happens? Moses' mother comes and she makes a basket. She weaves a basket, which is what? A little boat. It's a little ship. And she places the child in the basket and sets the child adrift on the Nile. And if you continue through the rest of the story, the child again is then taken in by the princess, and he's raised in the palace and comes back later on in order to become the hero and set the people free. And when he does that, as he leads the people out, as he himself has that experience of being protected from the chaotic waters, he becomes the leader that is able to do that for his community as well, as he leads them later on through the Red Sea. As they're leaving Egypt, he leads the people out of Egypt, and they go through the Red Sea on dry ground. But the Egyptians that are pursuing them, they get caught in the torrent as it comes back in, and they're drowned. And so if we can adopt a posture of finding ways in which to build these sorts of containers to house our own lives and the lives of those that are close to us, that's the way that we can navigate the world. And it requires a little bit of courage, because it requires going out into the water. It requires not just remaining rigid and stationary. A lot of times, as things are changing in our lives or in the world around us, we want to cling to the past. We want to hold on to the things that came before. But that's a surefire way to get drowned, right? It's like if we're just holding on to a tree, or we're just holding on to, our house or whatever, like that's a surefire way to not be able to make it through. What we need to do instead is to be able to break things apart, to build a boat, and to be able to then adapt to the changing world around us. And so I think that that's what that means symbolically as well. And so how do we do this? How do we build boats, right? Like you say, okay, so what does that mean? What does it mean to build a boat? And I think that metaphor, that symbol can be, we can consider it at a whole bunch of different levels. And it could be a little confusing at first, or maybe even a little bit overwhelming, because you say, well, I don't know how to do that. And I think that the next thing that we can learn from the text is that this is actually something that we are always doing. That this is something that that it comes naturally to us as human beings. I think that a lot of times we just don't realize that we're doing it. because we just don't notice the ways in which we do it. And so one of the things that we can learn again from the text is that what we are facing, the chaotic aspects that we're facing, and the shipbuilding projects that we need to undertake are nothing new. They are what we experience actually in the day to day. We think about in the Gospels, Christ, when he goes out and he begins to call his disciples, when he begins to gather a following to him, he teaches them about the kingdom of God. He's got this mission. It's got this grand world-changing mission that he's calling his disciples to go out with him upon. And you can imagine that must have been overwhelming for those disciples at first. It must have been something that they're like, well, we don't know how to do this. Like, we don't know how to change the world. And it's very interesting. The first thing that Christ does in those gospel accounts is he calls the disciples out onto the sea. He says, let's go out, put out your boats, and let's go out and let's go fishing. So they go fishing out on the water, and he teaches them he encourages them to go out and go fishing. And so they do that. And so there's like this call, and that is like the call to adventure, right? It's the call out on the water. This is why later on in the story, Jesus walks upon the water he calls to his disciples to come to him on the water, because that is what the call of adventure, the spirit of adventure is always doing. It's calling us out from that which is safe and secure and stable and just sort of reliable or whatever it might be, and calling us out into the adventure where transformation can take place. And so this is what Christ does. And so the disciples, they go out on the water. There's an old adage that's kind of a cliche, but I think it's so true. And that is, a ship is safe in harbor, but that's not what ships are for. And that's so true, right? Like this is what we are for. Like, we are called to be adventurers. We are called to be those that go out upon the water. There's that song by Leonard Cohen, right, where it says, Suzanne takes you down to the water, and all men must be sailors. All men must come. And it is that which calls to us to go out into the adventure, to have the courage to step out into the adventure. It's the call in a lot of ways of, it is that which calls to us. And really what the nature of that call is it's the call of love, isn't it? Because you think about what is it that gives us the courage to go out into the unknown, into something that we don't yet understand, or that we don't know what it is or how to do it. It's really love, because what is it that calls someone to start a new business? Or what is it that calls someone to create something new, or to start a painting, or to write a book? Or what is it that calls someone to start a family, or to have a child, or to fall in love? Like, these are dangerous, potentially sacrificial, potentially even frightening kinds of endeavors to step out into. But it is the desire for the beloved, is the desire for the thing that calls to us. And so the image of Christ calling his disciples out on the water, it's that same sort of image to us. And there are things in our lives that call to us. And so we have to have the courage to go out upon the water. And then once they're out there, this is what Christ teaches them, which is so fascinating. He teaches them this, and he says, there's this miraculous catch of fish. So they throw their nets out and they catch all this fish, and they get back to land. And Christ says to them, he says, now you see what you just did here with the fish. He says, you guys are fishermen. He says, now I'm going to make you fishers of men. And so what he's doing there is he's basically saying, he says, now listen, you guys are fishermen. You already know how to do this. Like, this is your job. Like, this is the thing that you do. Now we're just going to do this on the next level up. We're going to simply take the things that you're already doing, and we're going to step it up a notch. And that's the way in which the kingdom of God is going to come. That's the way in which the world gets created anew. And it starts with us just doing the things that we're already doing the things that we already know how to do, catching fish, right? And then realizing that scales upward, that all the things that we do, even at the most basic level, scale upward. And so when it comes to boat building, and when it comes to navigating the world, and we think about some of the big overwhelming things, whether it's the big project that you've always wanted to undertake, or whether it's the societal problems that we see in the world around us and it just seems so overwhelming, or whether it's the idea of starting a family or stepping out in some way, right? Or moving to another part of the world, or even just down the street, whatever it is. Those things can become overwhelming, but when we remember, what we need to remember in those times is that what we're simply doing is participating in what we're already doing. We're already building boats all the time. We're already catching fish all the time. All men must be sailors, right? We already are doing these kinds of things. We're already creating and recreating the world over and over again, all the time. And that's something that we constantly do. But the reason that sometimes that we don't see this and that we don't realize it is because we undervalue what we do at the smallest levels. And so this is another thing that we can learn, is not to undervalue the things that we do at the ground level, to realize that those things in a lot of ways are a smaller version of what's going on at the cosmic level and the way in which we recreate the world. Think about it this way. This would be a very simple illustration of this. Think about your thoughts. Think about what you do when you think. In a lot of ways, when you think, when you are organizing your thoughts, you are bringing order up out of chaos. You have all of these ideas. That's the sea, right? The sea of ideas. And you reach down into the water. You send your nets down into the water and you pull up thoughts, and you begin to form those thoughts together, right? You build a boat, you begin to pull things together, and you create this little boat that is a thought. And then those little boats can come together and form expressions and ideas that we can then form into language and sentences and conversations, right? Like these are the little ships that we send out, and we begin to then reach out to other people, and we begin to build relationship with other people. And then by building relationship with other people, then we begin to form communities. And what are those communities? But they are boats. They are little ships. They're little containers of order, united by common ideas and common language and common understanding and common experiences that help us to be able to navigate the world together. Friendships and communities and families. These are all ships. They're all boats in which we sail the world. And that is how we go out and remake the world. That's how we change the world, is by realizing that even the tiniest little ways in which we bring up order out of chaos, those are boats, those are ships. And that's the way the world gets changed through us. And we shouldn't undervalue those things. We should realize that those are important. And vice versa, on the other hand, we also need to remember this. On the negative sense, sometimes we undervalue the ways in which we allow chaos to begin to get into those boats. We undervalue and we kind of make excuses for the little ways in which things begin to fragment and break apart what's going on inside of us, in our minds, in our families, in our communities. We say, oh, well, I'll deal with that later on. But it's those little leaks, those little ways in which things get in that begin to fill the boats with water, and we begin to go down. And so we need to remember that even the little ways in which chaos gets into our lives, whether it's just simply disorganization in our houses, or whether it's disorganization in our thoughts, those are the little ways in which the sea gets in and can begin to bring things down. So we need to make sure that we value the little things that we do one way or another, whether it's in the positive or in the negative sense. You think about war, right? Like the greatest level of chaos that you can see in the world. How do wars come about? Many times they start with individuals. They start with people. But even those people, it's like they start with words. They start with the words that we speak, the ideas that form in our minds. And so we need to remember that these things are that important, because they scale all the way up to the cosmic level. So those seeds can go all the way up. One of the expressions of this is, there's an old saying that I think is really fascinating, which is that cleanliness is next to godliness. You've probably come across this. And so, but like, what does that mean? I actually think that statement, that idea, cleanliness is next to godliness, is a really powerful idea, because what it expresses is this, is that godliness, right? The kingdom of God here at the top actually starts at the ground level. It starts with little things, little disorganization that becomes organized, the way in which we pull order up out of the chaos. You'll hear me talk about Jordan Peterson from time to time. I think Jordan Peterson is absolutely brilliant and has had a lot of influence on people. And one of the most influential things that I think Jordan Peterson ever said, one of the things that went the most viral was his adage about his advice, particularly to young people who were experiencing this feeling of being overwhelmed by all of the stuff that was going on in their lives. And his advice to them was clean up your room. Take some little aspect of your life and transform it. Bring up order out of the chaos. Reduce the chaos of your life down to that which is manageable. And so that's the next thing I think that we can learn from these narratives and these ideas is to reduce the struggle down to that which is manageable. And to realize that by doing that, we are practicing the same thing that we are practicing at the highest levels possible. And so when you clean up your room, like you are reordering the world, you are bringing order up out of chaos by doing that. And we can do, and everything around us is constantly in a state of entropy, right? Science teaches us this, that things are constantly in a state of going down to disorder. And life itself consists in bringing that order back up, in resisting that kind of tendencies for things to come down to chaos. We see animals do this as well. Animals are constantly doing things to fight back the pull of entropy that pulls things down, that pulls their bodies down, that begins to fragment things all the way down to the bottom. And they do this for their own bodies and oftentimes for their offspring. Human beings are interesting because human beings also do this for the world around us, that we look around at the world and we see a mess and we say, well, you know what? I'm going to clean that up. I'm going to do whatever I can to be able to bring this back to a state of order. And so when we do that, we need to realize that is what that in a lot of ways is participating in the grand struggle, in participating in the bringing up of order out of chaos, even at the highest level. Everything wears down. Clothes become dirty and things become blunt and dull and need to be sharpened. But when we do that, when we bring order to those things, we are participating in a lot of ways in the act of God, you could say, back to the Genesis account of bringing order up out of disorder, of bringing things up. But sometimes we just have to reduce it down to what is manageable, of like, what can I do today? What can I do right now? In what way can I participate in you could say, the work of God today, even if that's just simply, picking something up off the floor. So reduce it down to that manageable level, and that can help us as well. And so I want to just encourage us that, we can all do this. We can all build our own boats, that when we begin to experience chaos and the kind of rising waters in our lives, that we can build boats, that we can let down nets, that we can begin to wring order up out of the chaos, and we can do it in small ways. And I want to encourage us to value those things, to realize that those things are valuable, not to undervalue them, to notice where things might be starting to leak a little bit and we're starting to become fragmented and to go down a little bit under the waves and the waters, to reduce things down to what's manageable for us to be able to manage just even on a single day or in a particular instance, and to recognize that as we're doing that, as we're engaging with and as we're facing some of the things that we're facing, maybe even as a culture and as individuals and communities, that we're not facing anything new, that grappling with these things, even though they are always changing and they always kind of take different forms, that this is what it is to be human, right? Like this is what it is, that as we reach down into the chaos and begin to bring order up out of those things, even though it might be messy, like that's what it is to be a human being, that what makes us human. And to return this back to the Genesis account is that after God creates the world and he creates all of these things, he creates human beings. And what does he do? He sets them in creation and he places a mandate upon them to go out and name the things of the world, to go out and to care for the garden, to go out and to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and care for the planet, to care for the earth and to care for creation. That's what it is to be human beings, to build boats and to bring things in as Noah does, to bring the creation in and to create these containers that are capable of sailing over the chaotic sea. And so I want to just encourage you with some of those thoughts, and I would encourage you to go back and check out some of the biblical accounts, particularly in Genesis and in the Gospels, and to see the ways in which the world gets created anew and the ways in which we do that even in our own lives. And so I want to invite you even this week to take a look at those, and then also just to share with us, if you would, a little bit about your own life. What are some ways in which you have been able to find small ways of kind of building boats, if you will, to be able to bring order to the chaos? Maybe what are some experiences that have been helpful for you with that? And maybe what are some ways in which you've begun to be able to reduce things down to that which is manageable, and to realize that that plays a part in the grand scale, in the great story of creation, and ways in which we can view the chaos not as simply an enemy or an adversary or something that has to be overwhelming or overpowering, but rather that we can look at it as the necessary state of the world out of which life begins to come. And so I leave you with those thoughts, and I look forward to seeing you and hearing from you once again in the next episode.